Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me in Washington? I'll take that as a yes. And I'd like to thank the Institute of Medicine for inviting me to present at this conference. Could I just have some reassurance that you can hear me? I'm getting no reassurance.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
I can hear nothing. If you stand at the podium and raise one finger for yes, then I'll know. Okay, thank you. So I'm very pleased to be speaking to an American audience about global issues related to agriculture, environment, and nutrition linkages for sustainable diets. The issues are sustainability. Diets, as we see around the world, are currently not sustainable. We have 870 million people who are hungry in the world. We have 2 billion people suffering micronutrient malnutrition and an estimated 2 billion people who are overweight and obese. Environments are not sustainable. We have ecosystems that have been degraded, sometimes forever, and we've had biodiversity loss. It continues to be lost, sometimes forever. And agriculture, as it is practiced in many places, is not sustainable. We have unsustainable monoculture agriculture, intensive livestock industries, excessive, often, use of agricultural chemicals, many examples along food chains and in food systems of food losses and waste, and a number of inefficiencies. Over the course of a couple of decades, FAO has been monitoring the number of hungry people in the world. And from the early 1990s to the present, we have seen some successes in the number of hungry people being reduced. Most of the world has shown progress, with the big exception being Sub-Saharan Africa and even lately Western Asia and North Africa. And these represent some of the hunger statistics that FAO produces every year. But among the successes, we have seen the prevalence of stunting decrease in some places. We have seen very little progress, though, in the reduction of stunting in Africa, unfortunately. And at the same time as we still have an exceptionally high level of stunting in the world, we have overweight and obesity in developing countries, these same countries where we have high levels of undernutrition. So we've seen overweight increase in Asia and Latin America, and not so much across the continent of Africa, but more and more individual countries are showing increases in the prevalence of overweight and obesity. And these are some data that just illustrate in developing countries the prevalence as percentage, it happens to be women, of underweight on the left side compared to overweight in the same countries on the right side. We see some countries where the disproportionate number is on the overweight and obesity side. For example, Egypt, Peru. I'm not sure if you're seeing my pointer. But at the same time, across the whole spectrum of body mass, we are showing a resistance to solving the problems of micronutrient malnutrition. Here's a map of prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies in developing countries. These happen to be micronutrients, iron, vitamin A, iodine, but it's really reflective of a huge problem related to the quality of diets, even in countries where the quantity of food is sufficient and the dietary energy supplies are adequate or even more than adequate. I wanted to bring in the topic of biodiversity and nutrition as one of the important environment sector issues. FAO has been working on this for a long time, and it became a formal activity because the CBD, the Conventional Biological Diversity, recognized the important linkages between nutrition and biodiversity, and the COP, the Conference of the Parties, which is the governing body of the Conventional Biological Diversity, at one of their meetings in 2004, noted the linkages between biodiversity, food, and nutrition, and the need to enhance the sustainable use of biodiversity to combat hunger and malnutrition. And they requested the CBD Executive Secretary, in collaboration with FAO and IPGRI, which is now Biodiversity International, to undertake a cross-cutting initiative on biodiversity for food and nutrition to deal with a number of issues, including the relevant Millennium Development Goals. And then the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture also requested FAO to evaluate in several different ways the relationship between biodiversity and nutrition. 8 priority actions were identified finally in 2005, and another 6 lower priority actions. I could link to that, but in the interest of time, I won't. All these documents are on the web. And then finally, in 2006, the Conference of the Parties adopted the framework for a cross-cutting initiative on biodiversity for food and nutrition. And just to refresh some memories and let other people know, when we talk about biodiversity for food and nutrition, we're talking about the ecosystem itself, the agroecological zone. We're talking about species, food species within that ecosystem, and then the genetic diversity within species. In other words, the taxonomic level below species, subspecies, varieties, breeds of animals. This is our biodiversity world. Now, in order to understand really what biodiversity for food and nutrition was in the context of diets as an ecosystem service, not just foods and not just nutrients in foods, we conducted a survey, Biodiversity and FAO, and we had a few hundred respondents from around the world, mostly mainstream nutrition scientists and academics. We asked them what sustainable diets should exclude, what is not compatible with sustainable diets. And overwhelmingly, they identified high agricultural chemical inputs into agriculture as not compatible. Also, monoculture agriculture, intensive livestock industries, transgenic modification to food, plants, and animals, and many other things that should not be part of a sustainable diet. We also asked what is compatible or what is necessary for a sustainable diet, and these same respondents said increasing the use of food biodiversity for addressing the problems of nutrition and better diets, enhancing the resilience of food systems, use of agricultural practices that respect the environment, consuming less meat, and greater use of biodiversity to meet nutrient requirements, and promoting healthy dietary patterns through local food systems. After that survey, another couple of activities were undertaken by FAO, Biodiversity International, and other partners, including a technical workshop on biodiversity in sustainable diets. Somehow I think you're not seeing my slides the way I'm seeing them. Okay, yes, Steve? Okay, you've got it. And then an international scientific symposium on biodiversity and sustainable diets, United Against Hunger. And this was held in Rome in 2010. From this international scientific symposium, came a consensus definition of sustainable diets. Sustainable diets were defined as those diets with low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, while optimizing both natural and human resources. And in addition, from that same scientific symposium, a working group put together what was called a draft code of conduct, but in the end will likely be just guidelines or code of practice for sustainable diets, the preamble of which was modeled on what is probably the most powerful code of conduct ever developed, certainly for the nutrition world, which is the code of conduct for the marketing of breast milk substitutes. And for this sustainable diets code of conduct, it was in the preamble written that in recognizing that the health of humans cannot be isolated from the health of ecosystems, and conscious that food, meaning unprocessed or moderately processed food, is an unequaled way of providing ideal nutrition for all ages and life stages. Also recognizing that the conservation and sustainable use of food biodiversity is an important part of human and ecosystem well-being. And I won't go on, but there are a dozen or more points in this sustainable diets preamble. And shortly after this, we had the Rio Plus 20 conference, the sustainability conference. And out of that came the United Nations Secretary General's very interesting and very provocative Zero Hunger Challenge. This is meant in some ways to be a follow-up to the Millennium Development Goals, and you'll see some similarities. For example, access to adequate food all year round, which is more or less compatible with Goal 1 of the Millennium Development Goals. All systems are sustainable, which is more or less compatible with Goal 7 of the Millennium Development Goals. And then other topics related to income and livelihoods. But interestingly, a very foresightful addition, which is zero loss and waste of food, which I'll also get to in my presentation. But back to food biodiversity. We rely on very few crops to provide the nutrients that we need and the dietary energy. But for example, food biodiversity in many common species of plants or many common foods is vast. Much vaster than what we currently utilize. Wheat, for example, there are at least 4 species and more than 100 varieties. Apricots, there are more than 140 varieties, and these foods are really reflective of the greater biodiversity in the world. Why is this important? It is not just important for the environment sector to prevent further biodiversity loss, but these varieties, so this genetic resource below species level taxonomically, represents huge nutrient varieties. The protein content, for example, of wheat can vary based on the variety, vary in a nutritionally significant way. Same with individual amino acids, B vitamins, individual fatty acids, and vitamin E, for example. Apricots, we see huge variation based on that genetic resource. The different varieties have different, statistically different and nutritionally significantly important differences in beta-carotene, some of the non-pro-vitamin A carotenoids, vitamin C. Grapes is one of the more interesting examples of food biodiversity. We've got several different species, Vitis vinifera being the most important grape wine species. In fact, in Europe, it is the only species of grape that can be used to make wine. And even within Vitis vinifera, there are thousands of varieties. We know these well. We know them by their varietal names of wine. And in addition to the nutrients being so different, when we look at the wine, we can see the difference between, say, a Sauvignon Blanc and a Merlot. We can smell the difference. We can taste the difference nutritionally and other bioactive non-nutrient content-wise. These are also different, and there are unique nutrient fingerprints for these different varieties of everything. And it doesn't just, it's not just fruits and vegetables, but it's also our staple crops. And we have, through our plant breeding programs focusing on yield and disease resistance, we have neglected thousands and thousands of varieties of rice, for example. In the past, we had in say, Korea, more than 4,000 varieties of rice in use. Presently, 12 varieties of rice can be identified. In Thailand, they had 16,000 varieties. Presently, we can find 37, but 50% of the area cultivated in rice is cultivated under only 2 varieties. And for rice, this is important too, because we have nutritionally significant differences in rice. This slide shows a number of nutrients, the nutrient ranges, the variety identified with the highest content of that particular nutrient, and the variety identified with the lowest content of that particular nutrient. Protein content can range from about 5.5% to nearly 15% in rice. Typically, we quote in the nutrition world an average number, 8.5. But this doesn't really do justice to the people who might be eating rice at the low end of that protein scale, or even the high end. So it behooves us as nutritionists to really identify where we have nutritionally significant differences in the foods that people are eating. And rice is just one example where we typically talk about rice as if it were a particular unique product with an average nutrient content, and this really doesn't do justice to the biodiversity of rice. If we take the ecosystem, and here we have a rice-based aquatic ecosystem, we have a number of edible species living within that aquatic ecosystem. And for example, in Cambodia, more than 100 species are collected from that rice-based aquatic ecosystem. And even though rice is providing most of the dietary energy for this population, it is the other food within that ecosystem, the other ecosystem services that provide the micronutrients and the high-quality protein and high-quality fatty acids to the diets of these people living in these rural communities. You intensify this system and you lose a lot of the sources of the micronutrient adequacy that populations have access to. So much so that the International Rice Commission recommended to its membership, these are rice producers around the world, that they should promote the sustainable development of aquatic biodiversity in rice-based ecosystems, and policy decisions and management measures should enhance the living aquatic resource base. And that attention should be given to the nutritional contribution of aquatic organisms in the diets of rural people who produce or depend on rice. But we have many, many examples of this issue. I don't, in the interest of time, I see I'm already running out of time, so I'll skip over some of these, except to say some very interesting sweet potato data shown here, the beta-carotene content. We have found that in many parts of the world, the low beta-carotene varieties are the ones promoted by agricultural extension workers, mainly because they didn't know the beta-carotene content was so low, they were being promoted on the basis of yield and disease resistance. And these were being promoted in countries where vitamin A deficiency was commonplace. And these high beta-carotene sweet potatoes, these are not products of biofortification. These are part of the normal existing biodiversity. I have a couple of other ecosystem slides. This one is Mongolia. Mongolia, you can see on the map above, I'm not sure I'm pointing correctly, but it's chronically food insecure. It's a landlocked country. You might wonder where the population gets their N-3 fatty acids, their omega-3 fatty acids. And through our nutrient requirements consultation, we know that people need about 2 grams per day. Well, they get it from a combination of a genetic trait of a local breed of horse, which is their main dairy animal, and the biodiversity of the grasslands where these animals feed, particularly from a family of small mint plants. You change one element in this picture, introduce a different hive-producing breed, or introduce a new feeding regime to increase the production of the milk, and the net result will be that the population will need their N-3 fatty acid requirement to be met by supplements. It will no longer be met by the foods in their local ecosystem. And this is the last slide I'll show about biodiversity. Here we have the famous banana that everybody knows, the Cavendish banana. It really has no vitamin A, no pro-vitamin A carotenoid content. Here we have some bananas from Pacific Island countries. You see these very colorful bananas. And we have, and some of these banana varieties have been found to have more than 8,500 micrograms of pro-vitamin A carotenoids per 100 grams. The interesting thing about these bananas is that they were neglected in the countries where they were growing. They were growing wild, falling to the ground, rotting. Meanwhile, children were still going blind from vitamin A deficiency in those countries. Now these bananas are being valued, they're being promoted, they're even so proud of these bananas they've put them on their postage stamps, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner. In addition to looking at the world as it exists now, FAO, together with partners, including CINE, the Center for Indigenous Peoples' Nutrition and the Environment, have looked at case studies of indigenous peoples' food systems around the world, 12 case studies. And the banana study is one of the 12 case studies. I'll skip over a few of these slides because I'm running out of time, but just to say that among the things that are being done, looking at the conservation and sustainable use of agrobiodiversity to improve nutrition, are characterizing agroecological zones for their ability to provide humans with their nutrient requirements. So in other words, food has been identified as an ecosystem service, but so are nutrients for human nutrition, and so are diets, ecosystem services. This shows the double pyramid. We're all familiar with food pyramids, even though the U.S. has now adopted a plate, but many countries still use the pyramid. And this double pyramid shows the food pyramid on the left, the environment pyramid on the right, and how foods that we should be eating least are the ones with the highest environmental impact. If somebody's speaking to me, I can't hear you, but I'm interpreting this as my time running out. Am I right?
That's correct.
So let me quickly move on to talk about some other issues. Quickly on food losses and waste. I'll skip straight to this slide. Through a number of studies, food losses and waste have been identified as being as being extremely high in many parts of the world. Europe and North America at the level of consumption, or let's say retail and household level. Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, it's more at the agriculture and post-harvest level. These represent a huge amount of resource, not just the food itself, but the natural and man-made resources that go into their production. But overconsumption is also an issue for food losses and waste, and we have within this production-consumption continuum an issue of excessive consumption reflected in obesity in the population of many places, not just developed countries but also developing countries. I won't bore you with the algorithms that we use to calculate these things, but in addition to the foods lost and wasted from the agriculture to the retail or household level, we could also consider that overweight and obesity is another increment that could be added to that food loss and waste data. And for sustainability issues, it would include probably mostly the overconsumption of animal protein over and above protein requirements. I'm almost through. This is, I think, my second to last slide. Obesity is an agriculture issue. It is not just a health sector issue. And obesity is new. It's a new phenomenon in the world. This is a picture of Britain's first obese man. He was such a phenomenon that you can see from this, this classified ad in the Times of London in 1806. He charged admission, 1 shilling, for people to visit him. And people did visit him, and he became a very rich man. Now you can see in the graph at the bottom, the prevalence of this type of obesity currently is about 3.5% for women and 1.5% for men, and ever growing. So what are some of the recommendations that can be made related to food loss and waste, which is important for sustainability? Here's a poster from the US. Buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local food, serve just enough, use what is left, and don't waste it. This is interesting for many reasons. Probably the most important interesting reason is it was issued in 1918 in the U.S. by the U.S. Food Administration, which was the predecessor of the USDA. This slide is for the Americans, and this slide was used to express pessimism in the world about what is important, and it really links nutrition and planetary well-being. You've got 2 people saying save the earth, and thousands of people saying save the Twinkie. And the 2 people saying save the earth are remarking we're doomed. I think the Twinkie was saved, and I don't know if the planet is saved yet. We need to improve the evidence base, and researchers around the world are contributing to that. And my last slide is this. I wanted to quote someone from Zambia. But first to say, biodiversity is really an important feature of sustainability. Dietary energy supply, which is how we measure hunger, it's the proxy for hunger, it can be satisfied without diversity. Micronutrient supply, however, cannot be satisfied without diversity. And more than a decade ago, at one of the CBD COP meetings, the delegate from Zambia said something very important that still rings true today. Agricultural biodiversity is a matter of life and death for us. We cannot separate agrobiodiversity from food security. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burlingame, for that very stimulating talk. I'm sure there are questions in the audience, but if you could hold your questions, we will have a question and answer session for the whole panel at the end of the 3 talks. So let me introduce our next speaker to talk about trade-offs between human and environmental health from a fish perspective. There's Dr. Cynthia Jones, who has got lengthy titles, but she is with the Old Dominion University Centre for Quantitative Fisheries Ecology. Dr. Jones?